So I'm curious, what do you think is Royal Caribbean's most beautiful ship, past or present? A very strong case could be made for the Sovereign of the Seas trio, or the ship that started it all, the 1970-built Song of Norway. Or perhaps the nearly identical Nordic Prince. The one-off Song of America gets points from me just for her magnificent horn. The Vision class was cool with its 3 distinct pairs of ships. If modern ships and size are your thing, there's always the Oasis, Quantum, or Icon class. A reasonable case can certainly be made for the Radiance class. And there's always the pioneering Voyager or slightly larger Freedom class. Some could be persuaded by the one-off Nordic Empress, later Empress of the Seas. And last, and maybe least, the likewise one-off Viking Serenade had a face only a mother could love, but to some, maybe that's all she needed. And now it's time for me to tell you all about my pick for prettiest ever Royal Caribbean ship. In 1993, while on a cruise in Norway, our excursion boat in Geiranger rounded the corner to this lovely apparition. Less than a tenth the size of some of today's Royal Caribbean behemoths, with her low, sleek profile and gracious curves, the Sun Viking, in my book, was the most beautiful ship in the popular cruise line's history, at least externally speaking. Her story began in 1968 when a trio of Norwegian shipping firms, Anders Wilhelmsen, I.M. Skaugen, and Gotas Larsen, joined forces to create a modern cruise line with a fleet of 3 purpose-built cruise ships, which they named Royal Caribbean. Overseen by marine architect Tage Wanborg, with exterior design by Geir Grung, the 3 new ships sported ultra-modern profiles with clipper bows. Eventually, as plans progressed, they were enhanced with an innovative funnel feature called the Viking Crown, a disc-shaped lounge that cantilevered above the aft decks. This fixture would distinguish them from other new builds and become a Royal Caribbean trademark. As the ships evolved, so did these signature features, growing larger and more sophisticated with time. The first in a new generation of purpose-built cruise ships versus cruise ferries or dual-purpose liners, the trio were constructed at the Wärtsilä shipyard in Helsinki, Finland. Wärtsilä was founded in 1834 and remains one of the world's largest suppliers of engines for ships and power stations. Now called Helsinki Shipyard, this facility has changed hands several times and has built an impressive roster of cruise ships, ferries, and icebreakers since Song of Norway, the first in this trio, was completed in 1970. The nearly identical Nordic Prince followed in 1971, and the slightly modified Sun Viking completed the set in 1972. By enclosing her well deck, Sun Viking's designers increased her size slightly. They also gave her a more rounded superstructure and a different bow form, as evidenced in this airbrush rendering of one of the prior ships that was modified to depict Sun Viking. In the early 1970s, this trio of ships defined a new era of Miami-based year-round Caribbean cruising with Song of Norway on a weekly run, and Nordic Prince and Sun Viking offering 14-night deep Caribbean itineraries. This popular advertisement from the day is actually a cutaway of Song of Norway that highlights many of the three ships' features. A comparison of deck plans shows the main architectural differences between the rounded Sun Viking and the Nordic Prince, which, while slightly different from Song of Norway, was more angular in form. By enclosing the well deck on Sun Viking, main deck had room for 6 more cabins, although all three ships were advertised at an identical 18,500 gross tons with a total capacity for 800 passengers. Now for some travel advisor style lingo. That gave these 380 cabin ships a very low double occupancy space ratio of 24.34, which is actually far below that of the 40.16 of the 225,000 gross ton Oasis of the Seas, with her double occupancy capacity for 5,602 guests. Instead of focusing on the ship's interiors, Royal Caribbean's brochures highlighted the novelties like the Viking crown and the porthole-lined pool. If you dug a bit, you could find shots of the cabins, talk about cozy, but most of the imagery being sold was dedicated to the lifestyle, food, and ports of call. Sun Viking's 14-night Miami-based Saturday departures would vary over time, but this is what she offered in late 1977 and early 1978. 2 days at sea gave passengers, this was before the term guests was in vogue, a chance to get to know the ship. On Tuesday, she called at San Juan, Wednesday, St. Thomas, and Thursday, Guadeloupe. If it was Friday, it must have been Barbados, and Saturday was all about Grenada. Sunday was another sea day, with Monday at La Guaira for Caracas, then Curaçao on Tuesday, followed by another sea day, with Thursday spent in Haiti. After another sea day, it was back to Miami on Saturday. Rinse and repeat. Double occupancy fares range from $1,710 for a peak season deluxe cabin to $990 for an off-season small inside. This was actually quite expensive by today's dollar, which would be 5 times as much. In those early years, Royal Caribbean printed out passenger lists for each cruise, and the daily program was equally of its time, with a mimeographed printout, lacking the fancy graphics that would come later. May 13, 1973 began in Nassau with shore excursions, and for those staying on board, deck games were available after 8:30. In the Annie Get Your Gun Lounge, What's Up Doc was the afternoon movie. At 4:30, there were cocktails for singles get-togethers, and the shop opened right after sailing at 5, with cocktails in the bars and showtime in the lounge of the Northern Lights. Tie and jacket were de rigueur for the evening dress code, and as the 70s moved on, Night Owls would top it all off with the latest disco tunes. On sea days, it was all about fun in the sun, and in the evening, balmy nights on deck, fancy dress parties, and a contribution to the tiny casino. A separate page was dedicated to meal and bar hours, beginning with a full-service breakfast menu with all the usual fare and a few twists like broiled kippers, sugar-cured bacon, and country grits. A relatively ordinary lunch menu was highlighted with the Lamb Curry Island Special, and the bar menus were color-coded with prices ranging from 50 cents to $1, which was cheap even after factoring in inflation. At dinner time, things got only slightly more interesting, with entrees including grouper, chicken and lobster, and prime rib au jus. And in those pre-specialty restaurant and 24-hour buffet years, there was the trusty midnight buffet with its carved veggies, ice sculptures, and long lines. In those early years, shipboard photographer Vince Neal captured Sun Viking at Pointe-à-Pitre, Guadeloupe, and at sea being passed by Song of Norway. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, Sun Viking stuck with her 2-week Caribbean itineraries. But as Royal Caribbean grew more popular and there was an increasing demand for berths, the Song of Norway and Nordic Prince were expanded in 1978 with the insertion of 85-foot midsections, raising their tonnage to 22,200 and capacity to 1,040. They returned to their builders, Wärtsilä, where they were cut in half so the prefabricated midsections could be added. For some reason, Sun Viking was spared this process, maintaining her original profile and, as the smallest ship in the fleet, getting deployed on far-reaching itineraries, while newer, bigger ships took her place. In the mid-1990s, she was cruising Alaska in the summer and doing occasional Mexican Riviera cruises. On May 8, 1994, she came to Los Angeles, where I captured her arrival and spent the afternoon on board. At this point in time, Royal was on the verge of introducing its Vision class of ships, and Sun Viking's career, along with those of her expanded sisters, Song of Norway and Nordic Prince, was nearing its end. In the stern view, you can see that symphony of curves, from the panorama of her Viking crown down to her perfectly rounded cruiser spoon stern. They just don't build them like this anymore. This is all a lost art in terms of ship design, but to be fair, today's squared-off sponsons are more hydrodynamically efficient. Now that she's almost tied up at Pier 93, the former Loveboat Terminal, Customs will need to clear the ship so her passengers can disembark, and then we can head on board. Including the flying bridge observation deck overlooking her bow, Sun Viking had 8 passenger decks. In addition, she had the Viking crown, which was reached only via an exterior staircase built into the aft base of her funnel. While they were extraordinary feats of engineering for their day, these early Viking crowns paled in comparison with those of the Song of America and the Sovereign class that followed, which could be accessed by elevators and wrapped around the entire funnel for a 360-degree panorama. Nonetheless, Sun Viking's crown provided a stunning view over the stern and must have been exhilarating at sea, especially in those early years. I'd have to note, though, that such a small space being given a capacity of 48 passengers must have felt very crowded during peak hours. The Viking longships etched into the bar's backsplash were a frequent motif on board the Scandinavian ships of this era and continue today with Viking cruises. Now let's head down to the flying bridge. The flying bridge offered passengers an ideal forward-facing vantage over the bow and lots of sunning space around the base of the radio mast. It overlooked the bridge wings on either side and the midships pool area aft. On the deck plans, Royal consolidated this level with the compass deck below, eliminating the wheelhouse and officers' accommodations that were actually on that level. And now for the actual compass deck, which, despite what the deck plan shows, began for passengers aft of the bridge wings and led to the sunwalks that extended outwards over the pool area in a gracious curve. After the pool, which was being painted that day, there was a terrace that linked both sides, which continued aft along the base of the funnel to a crescent-shaped terrace overlooking the stern. The forward sundeck vestibule followed a block of officers' accommodations. A modern artwork towered over the stairs, and doors led out to the pool, which was fronted by the pool bar. As I mentioned earlier, the pool was being repainted, which somewhat diminished its visual appeal, but in sunny climes, this was the ship's most popular daytime hub. All of the early Royal Caribbean ships, including Sun Viking, had hand-carved wooden name crests mounted above the pool. Sheltered passages on sundeck led aft on either side to the aft sundeck vestibule, which had a combination of traditional and contemporary Norwegian artworks. The far aft portion of sundeck was an open sports deck with a basketball court and shuffleboard courts. Like all the best cruise ships of any era, Sun Viking had a full wraparound teak promenade that began with an observation platform at the base of her superstructure. The open promenade stretched aft on both sides with cambered, polished teak decking, wide enough for deck chairs and walking space. The interior portion of Promenade Deck began with officers' accommodations, followed by the ship's best passenger cabins. The portside alleyway was called Court of the Antilles and originally accessed 9 deluxe staterooms. It's also where you could peek into the pool via voyeuristic portholes. We get our first taste of Sun Viking's kitschy decorative style with the compass room, a small card, games, and meeting room on the starboard side that could accommodate 24 guests. Wood laminates, highly polished brass, nautically themed art, and the occasional nautical instrument were all part of the early royal look. Directly across from the compass room on the port side of Promenade deck was the St. Martin Owner's Suite, which was an expanded deluxe cabin with a separate sitting area. It's pretty much average by today's standards, and unfortunately, it was the only cabin open to us that day. In between the compass room and St. Martin's Suite, a writing room and library nook lined the passage leading to the aft promenade deck vestibule. The Sun Viking stair tower vestibules had some of the ship's most interesting artworks and a modern Scandinavian style, with textured ceilings and brushed steel railings that were not unlike the more upscale Royal Viking Line ships of the same era. Access here at the aft end of Promenade deck was the lounge of the Northern Lights, a cabaret-style showroom with stage forward and bar aft. Vivid orange tabletops and textured glass panels in each corner emulated the 239-seat room's Aurora theme. With the Scandinavian mid-century style so in vogue, these tables would fetch top dollar today. Carnival Cruise Line's Joe Farkas is largely credited by the cruise industry for introducing entertainment architecture to the world's cruising fleet, but it was actually Danish architect Mogens Hammer who started it all in 1970 with this trio of ships and their public spaces, each designed with a decorative theme. Of course, Farkas took it all a few steps further, with more eye-popping colors, Tivoli lights, and neon, but his first themed public areas didn't arrive until the Festival of 1978, 6 years after the Sun Viking. Sun Viking's beautiful teak-lined promenades met at the stern with the open-air, sheltered veranda cafe buffet terrace. Of course, by today's standards, with its one counter, it's almost shockingly limited, but for its time, this is what cruise ship buffets look like. Some additional open-air seating was a bit further aft, but hold on to your plates if you plan to settle in and eat here. The next level restaurant deck was fully dedicated to public spaces. Mogens Hammer, Royal Caribbean's interior architect, was very fond of creating spaces inspired by famous musicals. On Sun Viking, the 440-seat forward showroom was named for The Merry Widow, an Austro-Hungarian operetta that became a Lana Turner movie. The room featured Art Nouveau-inspired stained glass panels with motifs from the show.
Hello, hello. MV Sun Viking.
And as you just heard, the dome over the dance floor was an acoustic treat or a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. The space could accommodate approximately half of the Sun Viking's complement and was a popular venue for live music, shows, and dancing. The Merry Widow was spacious and comfortable, with terraced alcoves that broke the room up into more intimate sections. You can even spot Lana Turner and Fernando Lamas in a panel off the starboard entry here. The musical theme continued on Promenade deck, where the forward vestibule was festooned in 19th century British Royal Navy motifs, as this was the entrance to the HMS Pinafore dining room, a not terribly subtle homage to the Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera. Typically, the day's menu was displayed at the entrance, along with the chaîne de rôtisseur plaque, something you'd find at the entrance to every cruise ship's dining room in the 70s and 80s. Huge frescoes depicting 19th century warships graced the fore and aft bulkheads here, and decorative flourishes included a giant lantern chandelier, molded cornices bearing more lanterns, ship models, and carved wooden busts. It couldn't get more corny, but it added to the festive atmosphere on board and certainly lacked pretense. Like the showroom, the 427-seat Pinafore could accommodate half the ship's clientele, requiring 2 assigned seatings. The galley was located aft of the dining room on the port side, while a seating gallery on the starboard side continued aft to the aft promenade deck vestibule. The seating gallery was broken up into 2 sections, each with its own paintings and sailing ship models. The aft restaurant deck lobby featured my favorite artwork on the ship, a large zinc engraving of Oslo Harbor with the Song of Norway by Cato Strom. Similar works were featured on all 3 Song of Norway class ships. On the port side of the aft restaurant deck lobby, and basically an afterthought in comparison with today's floating casinos, the Casino Royale occupied a small nook that could accommodate up to 51 passengers. Accessed on the starboard side or through the casino, the Annie Get Your Gun Lounge was the actual showroom, accommodating up to 384 passengers. With its overall good sightlines and large stage, it was a state-of-the-art venue for its day. Some of the room's decorative touches might be considered a bit outre by today's standards, but it's an homage to the 1950 film version of the Irving Berlin musical about Annie Oakley, starring Betty Hutton and Howard Keel. Passengers would enter the ship on the next level main deck, which was mainly dedicated to cabin accommodations. Main deck's forward vestibule boasted a pair of impressive ceramics and a large tapestry. A midship's alleyway led aft from here through a shop-lined passage to the main entrance hall. The cruise director's desk was on the aft starboard side and the purser's desk on the port side. In the center of the room, there was a pair of bronze Viking ship reliefs on gold mosaic by Ornulf Bast. And off the entrance on the starboard side, there is a portrait of the ship's godmother, Sigurd Skaugen. Meanwhile, Norway's King Olav V dominated the portside entrance. A deck and B deck had more accommodations than the medical center, and surprisingly for a ship even of her vintage, Sun Viking lacked a basic gym and spa. Despite her size and limitations, Sun Viking managed to last in the Royal Caribbean fold until late 1997, when she was sold to Singapore-based Star Cruises for $35 million and renamed Superstar Sagittarius. Her time offering short cruises out of Port Klang was brief, and in July of 1998 she was sold for $33.5 million and chartered to newly launched Hyundai Cruises, renamed Hyundai Pongye, and began cruising to North Korea. In 2001, she became the Pongye for China Ocean Deluxe Cruises, but was soon arrested for backdue crew and supply bills. Her next owner was casino mogul Stanley Ho, who renamed her Omar III for gambling cruises out of Hong Kong and later Singapore. In 2007, she was sold once again, becoming Longji, and operated for Asia Cruises on short gambling cruises out of Singapore. Despite her downgraded service, the ship was kept in cosmetically pristine condition, as these photos by maritime journalist Jonathan Boonzayer illustrate. Whether it was used or not, her pool was freshly painted and her teak decks were beautifully polished. That strom panel was still in place, and some of her vestibules and public rooms were well preserved. The majority of her lounges became casinos, while her dining room was refurbished, and main deck cabins were doubled into large, modern staterooms. In 2011, she was sold again, this time to Capital Dragon Holdings, who renamed her Oriental Dragon, for cruises from Shanghai to South Korea. She was sold again and chartered for Hong Kong and later Malaysian-based gambling cruises. In 2020, she was shut down due to the COVID pandemic and later arrested. In 2021, her name is altered to Dragon, and she sailed off to Gadani Beach in Pakistan, arriving in February of 2022 and subsequently scrapped at the grand old age of 50. All in all, I'd say she had a remarkable career. I hope you enjoyed this look at Royal Caribbean's most beautiful ship. Thank you for watching.